Good morning. It looks a little blurry, but it is outstanding in real life. All right, I'm gonna go backwards here and read us some more of the history of white people, white sugar, Neil Irvin Painter. We are on chapter 13, the American School of Anthropology. Now, a little gentle reminder, this has a lot of words from a lot of different languages, and I'm probably going to butcher them all equally. So no one should be offended individually that way. Okay. Emerson died in 1882, but his cold formulations did not die with him. Such crabbed views of American ancestry, appearance, and masculinity rolled on well into the future, and actually seemed mild when compared with the mean-spirited school of American anthropology. Emerson was aware of the toxic racial thinking of his time, and he rejected the worst of it. From the 18th century onward, racial schemes have flourished, each offering a different number of races, even a different number of Caucasian races. Emerson had to make sense of this from his perch in Concord, and thoroughly angelicized, he perforce looked not to his own country or to the European continent. He chose, rather, to seek reinforcements for his ideas in Great Britain, specifically in Sharon Turner's monumental multi-volume history of the Anglo-Saxons, which had popularized the foundational concept of racial traits, and in the work of his Scots, the geologist Robert Chambers and the physician, anthropologist Robert Knox. Their ideas struck Emerson as cleaner and of much finer provenance. So pretty. Okay. This had to do in part with the fact that most racial thought in the United States served to justify slavery. As such, was pretty. Okay. This had to do in part with the fact that most racial thought in the United States served to justify slavery, and as such was pretty mean-spirited. This was uncongenial to Emerson, who leaned toward abolitionism, but he had been determined to denigrate black people. Oh, my Lord. But had he been determined to denigrate black people, he might have looked at those widely respected American scholars who were eagerly consolidating a white supremacist American school of anthropology. Do you see my little friend? The dog is with me, and he is highly active and noisy. I've got a pet. Okay, well, you don't really have pets if they're wild animals, to be totally fair, but there's a roadrunner that lives here. And Wiley Dog can see him right now, and I cannot. So, I continue. Samuel George Morton, from 1799 to 1851, the most revered American anthropologist among them, began as the hard-working son of an immigrant Quaker family from Ireland. His merchant father died in Samuel's childhood, and his mother followed in 1817, when Samuel was 18 years old, when a rich uncle in the old country offered to finance his higher education. Morton seized the opportunity. He earned an M.D. degree in 1820 from the University of Pennsylvania and spent time in Edinburgh and Paris, the leading European centers for medical education. Along the way, Morton grew enamored with phrenology, then enjoying a great vogue in science. Okay. The actual originator of the American school was a Philadelphia medical doctor and admirer of phrenology named Charles Caldwell, who critically reviewed Samuel Stanhope Smith's essay on the causes of the variety of complexion and figure in the human species in 1811. Caldwell directly inspired Samuel George Morton. His University of Edinburgh M.D. awarded in 1823, and his European contacts did much to burnish a growing international reputation. Back home in Philadelphia, Morton gradually established himself in the city's medical community and scholarly societies. As a professor of anatomy between 1839 and 1843 at the University of Pennsylvania, the best medical school in the United States, Morton reached a wide audience of leading American medical doctors and anthropologists. Skulls ruled the day in American anthropology, an enthusiasm that would lead seamlessly into the fetish of craniometry early in the 20th century and on into intelligence testing during the First World War and beyond. Morton owned a lot of skulls. At his death in 1851, his collection comprised 918, hey, that's 918, human skulls. 51 more were still in transit. 278 crania of other mammals, 271 of birds, and 88 of reptiles and fish. A collection worthy of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Alright. Little dog sneaking around the car. Not very sneaky. Morton had diligently measured each human skull along 12 different axes, and that is AXES, up and down, sideways, back and forth, in, around, and interior volume, and written up his findings in widely praised studies of American Indians called Crania Americana from 1839, and ancient Egyptians called Crania Egyptica from 1844. Morton's fame stemmed from his measurements of cranial capacity, which he judged to predict intellectual ability according to race. On this basis, Morton ranked American Indians as a separate race, somewhere midway between white and black people, thereby proving conclusively the existence of racial difference. My word, it's beautiful. Thank you for being with me. On this basis, Morton ranked American Indians as a separate race, somewhere midway between white and black people, thereby proving conclusively the existence of racial difference, to his own satisfaction, as well as to that of his contemporaries. And down at this little bottom is a note that says, The Mismeasure of Man from 1996. Stephen Jay Gould's classic study of physical anthropology and intelligence testing deems Morton's cranial measurements badly flawed. More recently, however, the Michigan anthropologist C. Loring Brace, in something called Race is a four-letter word, the genesis of the concept, has contested Gould's findings and vindicated Morton's measurements, but not his overall findings. Brace does not support Morton's conclusion regarding relative racial intelligence as revealed in cranial measurements, but he respects Morton's methodology, ascribing the flaws to Gould. All right. Morton also possessed some Inuit skills. What was to be deduced about their race. Okay, let me try that all over again. Morton also possessed some Inuit skulls, not skills. And what was to be deduced about their race? Not knowing how to answer that, he simply set them aside, just as European racial theorists had alternately expelled and accepted lapse in jiggering European racial identity. So pretty. Clearly, these were tortured calculations, none more so than Morton's classification of different socioeconomic strata of ancient Egyptians as different races in Crania Egyptica. He counted most Egyptians as Caucasian, but a minority as Negro, while on the same time dividing them into three further types: Pelasgic, Semitic, and Egyptian. All right, I'm going to spell it. Pelasgic. And the next one is Semitic. And the last one is Egyptian. Egyptian. Those three were suspiciously stereotypical as white, Jewish, and black racial lines. Much of this echoed Winckelmann on the beauty and symmetry of ancient Greek and Petrarch Camper's concept of the facial angle. At the top of Morton's heap were large crania and straight facial angles, denoted as pelasgic, or Greek. The summary and delicacy of the whole osteological structure make the pelasgic familiar to us in the beautiful models of Grecian art. And near the bottom were skulls Morton categorized as Semitic types resembling, he said, Hebrew communities, characterized by a comparatively receding forehead, long, arched, and very prominent nose, and in some, a strong and often harsh development of the whole facial structure. The Semitic race, he contends, ought not to be accorded much respect, having been admitted into Egypt only upon sufferance. All smaller skulls belonged to slaves, dumber, darker-skinned examples of the Egyptian type. They interest Morton even less than his Semitic types, and rate hardly any descriptions. So much for Jews and Africans in Morton's Egypt. There's a little side note about Morton's Egypt. Morton and his followers departed from the prevailing orthodoxy of James Cowles Pritchard in The Natural History of Man, comprising inquiries into the modifying influence of physical and moral agencies on the different tribes of the human family from 1848. Pritchard classified North Africans, including Egyptians, as people of African origin. Pritchard, whom Arthur de Gobineau, also Pylord, which is consistently misspelling Pritchard's name, insisted on the single creation of mankind with the subsequent elaboration of separate tribes. Pritchard was the mid-19th century monogynist par excellence. I don't feel like that helped me a lot, but I'm glad that we read it together because it's in the book, and I try really hard to put the stuff in the book in the video and not just my commentary on how hard the words are and how much I care for you to read this book with that kind of a sunrise. Oh my goodness. It's the little things that make life beautiful. Or make it memorable for that matter, huh? Alright, back to our little story here. For Morton and his many admirers, including Robert Knox in Scotland and Arthur de Gobineau in France, the greatness of ancient Egypt seals the permanence of racial hierarchies, the very bedrock of 19th century racial theory, like that of the ancient Greeks, deemed very similar to 19th century Gentile Northern Europeans. Ancient Egypt's glory is linked to the superiority of white people, Americans included. Never mind puzzling details. What looked like woolly hair in ancient Egyptian depictions, Morton deems wigs worn by Egyptians over their real hair, which surely was straight and light-colored, like that of the fairest Europeans of the present day. Why Egyptians would wear woolly-haired wigs does not rate an explanation. Plunging forward, Morton pronounces the cranial formations of ancient Egyptians, at least the better dressed and more pompously buried Egyptians, identical to that of the modern white man. Some more explaining that crap. Why did Morton's equations of prominent ancient Egyptians and the modern white man make sense to race theorists? The answer has everything to do with the wealth and power of nations of their own time. Again and again, racial hierarchies set the poor and powerless at the bottom, and the rich and powerful at the top. The early 20th century socialist Max Weber says it well. While the nobility believe their superiority grows out of their underived ultimate and qualitatively distinctive being. Oh my gosh, let me try it again. The early 20th century sociologist Max Weber says it well. While the nobility believe their superiority grows out of their, quote, underived, ultimate, and qualitatively distinctive being, unquote, no one in favored circumstances wants to admit the chanciness of privilege. Another quote, the fortunate man, Weber says, is seldom satisfied with the fact of being fortunate. Beyond this, he needs to know that he has a right to his good fortune. He wants to be convinced that he deserves it, and above all, that he deserves it in comparison with others. Good fortune thus wants to be legitimate fortune. Innate qualities are needed to prove the justice, the naturalness, and inalterability of the status quo. In the United States, in Samuel George Morton's Philadelphia, where the buying and selling of laborers extended into the 19th century, that often turned into a justification for African slavery. Little side note. Pennsylvania emancipated the slaves in 1780, but the law allowed the indenturing of children until they were at least 28 years old. Indentures could be bought and sold in the open market. 28 years old. Morton's work on skulls earned him enormous prestige in the United States and in France, where he impressed even Paul Broca, the most prominent French anthropologist, who was also a polygenicist. In 1861, okay, here's a little sign, brain size and intelligence. In 1861, controversy in French anthropology over French and German head size echoed Martin's notions of racial superiority. All the prominent anthropologists of the time assumed that brain size was correlated with intelligence. Here lay the problem. Bigger bodies house bigger heads, and bigger heads house bigger brains. German bodies, even of professors, were bigger than French bodies. Therefore, German brains were bigger than French brains. What were French anthropologists to do? Were Germans simply smarter? Even French anthropologists, who accepted a correlation between head size and intelligence when applied to other people, reckoned uneasily that the correlation did not always hold. The debate was never resolved, only rendered trivial with the passage of time. Skulls kept their pride of place in anthropology, and with them, the owner of a world-class collection. So firmly did Morton personify the American School of Anthropology that a visit with him became obligatory for ambitious young scientists. Two key visitors were Josiah Nott and Louis Agassiz. All right, let's see who these people are. Josiah Nott studied at the University of Pennsylvania, where Samuel Morton taught in the years 1839 through 43, but he graduated in 1827 before Morton joined the facility. Oh, okay. And here's another little side note. While anthropologists differed on the meaning of various skull measurements, their confidence that all these measurements meant something seemed not to have wavered. One of them, Louis Pierre Gratiolet, designed 3 human races according to the part of the brain their physiognomy expressed: frontal, parietal, and occipital, which we still use those when we're talking about the brain. All right, this is from 1804. Josiah Nott, born 1804, and he lived through 73. Scion of a prosperous South Carolina family, received his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania after undergraduate study at the College of South Carolina. An accomplished surgeon and founder of the University of Alabama School of Medicine, the agnostic Nott loved annoying traditional believers. As a polygenicist, he disputed the account of creation in Genesis in his first major publication, called 2 Lectures on the Natural History of the Caucasian and Negro Races, from 1844. The races were created separately, Nott argues, well before the beginning of biblical time. Side note, Nott's most persistent opponent in the monogenesis-polygenesis dispute was a New Yorker turned South Carolinian, the Reverend John Bachman, minister of St. John's Lutheran Church in Charleston. Bachman, who had an 1848 PhD from the University of Berlin, began criticizing Nott in 1849. All right, let's go back now. Okay. Yeah, that was all. Okay. For Nott and others in the American School of Anthropology, multiple creations had to mean that the history of the Pentateuch, okay, P-E-N-T-A, Penta, and then it is T-E-U-C-H, Pentateuch. It's little parenthesis says is the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Torah. It applies only to white Westerners. Non-white peoples had separate histories, told presumably in their own various books of Genesis. This view enjoyed international currency. Though he lived in Mobile, Alabama, in the deepest South, Nott kept up with the latest in European anthropology. Reading Gobineau's pessimistic 1,000-page Ethos or Racist Humanities, Nott exclaimed that he had seldom pursued a work which had afforded him so much pleasure and instruction. Right up front in his dedication to the Saxon, King George V of Hanover, Gobineau proclaimed convictions. Here's his little quote. That the racial question overshadows all other problems of history, that it holds the key to them all, and that the inequality of the races bound to entrance not. Okay, that was terrible. My eagles are the eagles. Our eagles here in Oklahoma are up stretching their wings. I'm going to read that again, in spite of I don't want to. Okay, so Nott exclaimed that he had, and then here's a little quote, seldom pursued a work which had afforded him so much pleasure and instruction. And then he dedicated it to the Saxon King George of Hanover. Gobineau proclaimed convictions. And here's his conviction. That the racial question overshadows all other problems of history, that it holds the key to them all, and that the inequality of the races, and this was bound to entrance Nott. Okay. Nott disregarded the way Gobineau ended his sentence. The inequality of the races from whose fusion a people is formed is enough to explain the whole course of its destiny. The American was not about racial fusion. Like many other racists, Gobineau had seemingly mastered the multilingual contents of entire libraries to formulate a universal truth that energetic races, certainly the Aryan, created national greatness. In turn, Aryan prosperity was fated to attract inferior races. Just as inevitably the races would mix, the superior race would degenerate, and the nation would collapse in revolution. According to Gobineau, this inexorable process of race degeneration explained the catastrophic the superior race would degenerate and the nation would collapse in revolution. According to Gobineau, this inexorable process of race degeneration explained the catastrophic, to him, revolutions of 1848. Gobineau took the concept of an Aryan, quote-unquote race out of the obscure scholarship of philologists studying dead languages like Sanskrit, and eventually made it familiar. In the 1780s, William Jones, a British linguist, had discovered a resemblance between Sanskrit and classical Greek and Latin. Other scholars, such as Franz Bopp in Berlin, Friedrich Schlegel in Paris and Berlin, and Max Müller in Oxford, elaborated the relationship between languages and peoples in the early 19th century. They postulated the existence of a Proto-Indo-European language that had spawned Indo-European languages spoken widely from the Indian subcontinent to Western Europe. Thus, the 19th century rage for races turned languages into peoples, and the word Arya, meaning noble or spiritual, in Sanskrit, came to be applied to an imagined superior race of Aryans. Some resistance to the conflation of language and race did arise. Müller of Oxford, the leading English-speaking comparative philologist, ultimately backed away from the often anti-Semitic identification of Aryan with a race rather than a language. But his awakening came too late. Racial extremists like Gobineau had already applied the term to the idea of a superior race, dooming it to a racial future. Even so, the term Aryan did not enjoy wide popularity until the early 20th century English publication of Gobineau's Essai. Nor was Aryan the most useful concept Josiah not discovered in Gobineau's work. Rather, Knott found two essential points. First, races are unequal, and second, race mixing is therefore bad. He heartily endorsed both sentiments long before Gobineau's essay gained other adherents. For several years after its publication in 1853, Gobineau's essays went largely unread, and when read, was not particularly appreciated. In a personal letter to Gobineau, Alexis de Tocqueville, Gobineau's mentor, denounced the work as promoting spiritual lassitude because its racial determinism deprived individuals of free will and destroyed any motivation to improve. But Knott had resolved to spread the word to American audiences. In 1855, he hired the 21-year-old Swiss-born Henry Hotze of Mobile to help him translate Gobineau's Essai, but strictly according to Knott's Southern slaveholding ideology. All right, and this little side note. After working for the Mobile Register, Hotze served briefly in Mobile's Confederate militia and as a commercial and secret agent for the Confederacy in London, where he published a Confederate newspaper through the duration of the war. One of Hotze's contacts among British people sympathetic to the Confederacy was Dr. James Hunt, a disciple of Robert Knox, who had founded the Anthropological Society to advance Negrophobic anthropology. This translation, entitled, what a long title, The Moral and Intellectual Diversity of Races, with particular reference to their respective influence in the civil and political history of mankind, from the French of Count A. de Gobineau, 1856, bears Gobineau's name as author, but much of it is pure not the other guy. For instance, he corrects Gobineau's lack of interest in African slavery through a polygenesis appendix of his own, showing Morton's cranial measurements laid out according to Morton's taxonomy. Gobineau, interestingly, denounced this amendment as a distortion of his thought. The denunciation was well deserved, for Gobineau says quite clearly that Africans contribute positively to the mixture of races in prosperous metropolitan centers by offering Dionysian gifts such as passion, dance, music, rhythm, light-heartedness, and sensuality. Whites, for their part, contribute energy, action, perseverance, rationality, and technical aptitude. The Apollonian gifts. In the short run, and even though the final outcome must entail utter ruin, this is all for the good, at least for Gobineau, but not for naught. While Gobineau sees whites as obviously racially superior, they are insufficient in and of themselves and need the contributions of other races for the development of civilization. Little side note. In 1855, when Nott and Hotze were preparing their version of Gobineau's Essai, Tocqueville was proposing Gobineau to the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, to which Tocqueville and his traveling companion Beaumont had been elected in the 1830s. Tocqueville disliked Gobineau's Essai, but was fond of Gobineau personally. Gobineau's Africans contribute to mixture, even though mixture inevitably causes revolution. The European revolutions of 1848 terrified Gobineau, but failed to interest Nott. Other sharp differences divided Nott and Gobineau. They lived on different continents, surrounded by different peoples, and motivated by different political events. Each defined the concept of races in order to answer his particular needs. Gobineau was an anti-democratic reactionary, explaining political revolution by pitting the Aryan race against other, inferior white-skinned races. Not a slaveholding reactionary railing against abolitionists, saw a white race pitted against a black one. Race as color occupied Nott's center stage, while Gobineau kept his eye on the Celts, the Slavs, and the Aryans. As a result, Nott's loose translation retained Gobineau's fear of race mixing, but discarded whatever else did not apply. Out went Gobineau's anxieties over the people of Eastern Europe and his pessimistic view of white Americans. All in all, Nott's awkward translation of Gobineau never added much to American racial bubblings, never amounted to much more than an obscure provincial publication. All right, and then again, another side note. Got one page left. Stay with me. And you know that's both sides, right? So it's 2 pages. Let's read this. The theme of Aryan beauty runs through Gobineau's 1,000 pages of text. Gobineau and Emerson seem to have been echoing each other in their pains to the blood barbarian Leviathan, with his red and white complexion, broad shoulders, great height, and utter fearlessness, and their conviction that Anglo-Saxons stemmed from Scandinavia and conserved the vital Aryan essence. And then we continue. Early on in 1843, Nott had published an important article on miscegenation, racial science, boogaboo. His title says it all. The Mulatto, a Hybrid. Probable examination of the two races if the whites and blacks are allowed to marry. Why would Nott write that the mating of blacks and whites would produce infertile hybrids, when a glance around his own Alabama neighborhood would have put the lie to this notion? More to the real point, the possibility of mixed marriage doubtless annoyed. More to the real point, the possibility of mixed marriage doubtless annoyed Nott far more than the inevitable mixed sex. In any case, while the theory of infertile progeny made no sense in theory or practice, it did serve Nott's scholarly purposes and pushed along his fine scientific reputation. Having made his name, Nott burnished it by compiling two anthologies. One is titled Types of Mankind from 1854, and the other one is Indigenous Races of the Earth from 1857, both published with George R. Gliddon, an Englishman long resident in Egypt, who had supplied Morton with skulls and Nott with inspiration. Gliddon's wife drew the illustrations in the book Types of Mankind. That both of these flimsy books sold extremely well demonstrates how little rigor 19th century scholarly race talk required. Cobbled together from the miscellaneous pieces in various genres and lengths by a wide array of contributors, each anthology included pieces by Luis Agassiz, whose luminous European origin and Harvard affiliation gave any work a certain scientific cachet. Oh, that's extra information about Gobineau. So hang on before I start the next one. Let me add this in. An unsigned review in Putnam's Monthly of January 1856 discusses moral and intellectual diversity of races with care. The reviewer regrets Holt's and Nott's emasculation of Gobineau's original, while disagreeing, as had Tocqueville, with Gobineau's fatalism. The reviewer concludes that the translation is worth reading. Gobineau's great vogue came with the late 19th and early 20th century Tulipomania of German nationalists like Richard Wagner, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and Madison Grant. When a new English translation of Gobineau was published in 1915, it, rather than Nott's, found a growing and appreciative audience of nationalists and eugenicists. No English editions of Gobineau's Essai appeared between 1856 and 1915. All right, and the last piece for this chapter, am I freezing? Louis Agassiz, Agassiz, 1807 through 1873, a charming German-educated Swiss physician scholar, had made his name as a follower of the French naturalist Georges Cuvier. Glimpsing opportunities across the sea, Agassiz sailed to the United States in 1846 on the kind of lecture tour intended to generate permanent remunerative employ. Remunerative. Oh, that's a word I don't know. I mean, I know parts of it. It's spelled Remunerative. whatever, employ. Oh, we got a little note down here. George Glidden had come to the United States for the second time on a similar quest, but he never found steady work and became one of Knott's permanent dependents. Okay, so getting employment matters. Stopping first in Philadelphia, Agassiz paid his respects to Samuel George Morton, then moved on to deliver lectures in 1847 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he found sponsors of a professorship at Harvard. 12 years later, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, a book that conquered biology and changed science forever. But Darwin did not conquer Agassiz, who, famously, never accepted Darwin's concept of evolutionary change. To his very end, Agassiz preferred a polygenesis scheme in which God had created the races separately at the very beginning. Even so, with the founding of the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology, Agassiz presided over a scholarly institution of enormous influence. For 26 years, until his death, he shaped not only the world of American natural history museums, but also the field of American anthropology, which natural history museums housed until well into the 20th century. This legacy he passed on to his Harvard protege and successor, the Kentuckian Nathaniel Southgate Shaler, from 1841 to 1906. Shaler became a fixture at Harvard during the 1870s, often referring to Agassiz as my master. As a professor of geology, paleontology, and scientific truth in general, Shaler taught a generation of men destined to lead the United States, including Theodore Roosevelt. Through his commentary on American life, Shaler's Anglo-Saxon chauvinism provided a bulwark to the New England-based movement against immigrants from the Southern and Eastern Europe. Today, after the mid-20th century reshuffling of race into a black-white binary, Shaler appears in history as a proponent of black inferiority. But in the 1880s and 1890s, he also, and mainly, helped alleviate the figure of the white male Kentuckian into an emblem of America, and took aim at Southern and Eastern European immigrants as menaces to American racial integrity. And the last part of this chapter. The American School of Anthropology faded after the publication of its master works in the 1850s, which was Darwin's Origin of Species. One of its core tenets that different races constitute different species, and stemmed from several separate racial creations known as polygenesis. It lost a good deal of credibility with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, but its racist notions served the needs of American culture too well to disappear entirely. Indeed, the American school's founding belief in permanent and unchanging racial identity has yet to expire. By the early 1890s, the American leaders in anthropology, which are Morton, Knott, Agassiz, had done their work and passed from the scene. White race taxonomy was in any case evolving into notions of immigration, restrictions, and eugenics. Samuel George Morton had died at 52 in 1851, following Confederate service and disappointment with the post-slavery South. Knott died in 1873, the same year as Louis Agassiz, after a long cognitive decline. Agassiz's friend Emerson died in 1882, as did Gobineau. They left behind a dour legacy, the fetishization of tall, pale, blonde, beautiful Anglo-Saxons, a fascination with skulls and head measurements, the drawing of racial lines and the fixing of racial types, the ranking of race along a single evolutionary line of development, and a preoccupation with sex, reproduction, and sexual attractiveness. All this proved not only durable but also applicable to people now considered white. Whew, that is the end of that. Bring my little book up here so everybody can see what we're reading here. And how far we are. We are well over halfway. Can't remember how many chapters are. Let's go check. Oh yeah, there's 28. And we're on 14, so we are literally halfway. We're not over halfway. That book size, it feels like it. Because I'm holding the book in my hand. I want to appreciate you for being with me, letting me read to you.